Right, this is my final presentation on the perspectives that we've learned throughout the class. I don't think there's really much more to say, so we'll just go ahead and get right into it. The first perspective that we discussed was the critical perspectives um, perspective, I guess. In this perspective, content and communication are priority number one, making sure that students understand what's going on, why they're doing what they're doing, and what is expected of them, as well as what the content is. So rather than just focusing on language, content is just as important. Students focus on content. Accuracy is not nearly as important with the language. This is much more focused on actually expressing yourself rather than, excuse me, than making sure you say it correctly. And one of the big ideas about this perspective is the idea that language is a source of power, that how you speak, what you speak, says a lot about you, and how you define or defend your language and your culture is a huge identity piece. To the in-text examples that really highlight these ideas was the first, that I needed to explore how English came to power and how that power makes some people feel welcome and others feel like outsiders. This is shortly after Christensen talks about being in staff meetings where counting grammatical errors by an administrator is a form of sport. She said that it's this kind of practice that makes people feel really uh, inferior and alien to the language. She said, when students feel attacked by the red pen or the tongue for the way they write or speak, they either make themselves small or don't turn anything in at all. She said that we need to get away from the idea that we need to mark them so harshly that they're speaking perfect English, because that gets in the way of them expressing themselves, and eventually they just won't want to do anything at all. Some different teaching ideas and examples for this would be things like Content Jeopardy. This kind of game focuses on the content and allows students to express their answers and their ideas without having to worry about grammatical mistakes or specifically wording it like you would in a paper or in a final essay. A second language exploration project, focusing on how a language other than your own, kind of like we did in class, how it came to power, what it allows people to do, and what it provides in terms of benefits for other individuals. In a home language history, finding out the history of your own home language, finding out how the language that you speak now is critical and key, and where it provides a lot of power. The second perspective is a sociocultural approach. This one is a big focus on scaffolding and a lot of different devices, such as mnemonic devices, things that allow students to tackle harder academic language content without being handheld all the way through, but without also being left to the wolves. Content is varied, interesting, and relevant. It's very much focused towards things that the students would be interested in because it's relevant to them. So history lessons that tie into things happening today, for example. Walqui gives a lot of text examples, but the couple that I really highlighted here, they said that teachers sustain academic rigor by keeping the focus clear, both on language and on content. But the idea here is that when you're vague about what you're wanting to do as a teacher, the students can sense that, and the students will feel like their jobs are vague. It is a teacher's job to take the immense potential students bring into the classroom and transform it into reality by scaffolding students' access to the high challenge tasks teachers invite them to engage in. This is the idea that it's the teacher's job to make the students want to be interested. It's the teacher's job to make sure that students are being adequately challenged without being too challenged. Some of the teaching ideas that can incorporate that are things such as sculpting projects around current events. If there's a recent political event, for example, if I were to be doing a lesson plan right now, I might see if I could focus around the Turkish coup that happened or some of the events that have been going on in Dallas, just to make sure that students are aware that the world that is happening today is still relevant to the content that they're learning. One of the very important points that Walkie highlights that I think was a very integral idea to bring into the classroom is to maintain outcomes across ELL levels but modify difficulty. So rather than expect something completely different for a lower proficiency level than a higher proficiency level, we need to make sure that they're ascertaining the same content but at a level that's appropriate to their proficiency level. So I believe one of the examples in the text was studying brain trauma effects. And so a lower proficiency level might focus on the social effects of brain trauma, whereas a higher proficiency level might focus on the chemistry in the brain and how it changes due to trauma. They're both studying about brain trauma, but the difficulty is different based on their proficiency levels. And that kind of gives an example of just scaffolding difficulty based on ELL levels. If you're a higher proficiency level, you'll probably need less scaffolding than a lower proficiency level. That's not to say that you remove the scaffolding entirely, but you scale it appropriately to what their proficiency level is for the content. Krashen's natural acquisition. This is Krashen 101, really honestly. Grammar study provides no benefit on writing skill. He believes that grammar does absolutely nothing towards anything in developing your writing skill. He says that we need to give students skills to acquire knowledge rather than memorizing drills. So teach students how to access the information that they need to know that they're deficient in rather than just having them memorize what they're deficient in so that they can be self-sufficient. And then, really honestly, his input hypothesis is reiterated as stating that reading gives more opportunity for input for writing improvement. The more students read, the more they're exposed to higher level language and the more they can begin to improve their writing. There's a lot of examples for this because Krashen cites himself a lot, so he's able to really sculpt the argument, but the key ones is, the black and white quote, there is no relationship between grammar study and writing. And one of the other things he highlights is that current wisdom on editing agrees that such editing should be delayed until the final draft. He believes that we need to get ideas out on the paper first before we start worrying about editing and grammar. And our goal should be to develop competent users of grammar handbooks. Rather than having them memorize the grammar rules, we need to teach them how to use the texts and resources that they have available in order to avoid or eliminate any deficiencies they have currently. So some of the ideas that you can incorporate from Krashen are having grading rubrics that only judge grammar and spelling on a final draft. So when you're grading a rough draft, focusing solely on the core ideas would give a lot more confidence to students. Providing thesauruses, dictionaries, and writing rule resources at all times so that students always have access to knowledge and to resources that improve their writing ability. And then providing extensive opportunities for reading, maybe a reading book once a month or something, or a reading club, something that allows students to be engaged and motivated in higher level reading. The final perspective is the explicit and systematic ELD, English language development. The core ideas of this perspective are that structure and organization provide opportunities for grammar and function learning. That's basically to say that this is a pull-out system, that there should be, or at least not necessarily a pull-out system, but to a certain extent, dedicated time for language development. So rather than trying to integrate it with other things, this is a very explicit, we're focusing on language development at the current time, hence the name, explicit ELD. There's a huge focus on the form of the language, so this would be in almost direct clash with Krashen that grammar needs to be highly focused on. And the language, culture, and experience of students are seen as valuable additions to the classroom. So rather than trying to whitewash or focus on the proper English, the students' experiences need to be brought into the classroom and shown to have value. And some of the in-text examples that Dutrow really highlights the benefits of this system are that lessons can be based on literature, content, or activities, but must provide focus on the forms of the language. And this really highlights that idea that this is solely about language development. Content can be used to scaffold that, but language needs to be the focus. Systematic ELD uses an organized method that does not lead the development of language to random experiences and chance encounters. And this would be the exact opposite of Krashen again, because Krashen believes that the more reading you do, the more just language you're exposed to in general, the better of a development you'll have. This instruction must be provided within an environment that builds upon the value of the language, culture, and experience of each student. And again, that's the idea that students bring more to the table than just empty heads waiting to be filled with knowledge. For teaching ideas of this perspective, teaching language across content areas is a very big one. Again, highlighting what content students are learning is good, but you need to be making sure that the focus is on the language rather than the content. Structure projects to include students' cultural backgrounds. I think that this is one of the most important things that we can do to highlight, and this kind of goes back to the first perspective, to highlight the power of the language. So if students feel like their culture, their language, their backgrounds have power to them, then they'll feel more confident in learning a second language because they're very secure in their own. One of the big ones that was highlighted in this article that I think is another important one is group students of different proficiency levels to increase exposure. So having students of different proficiency levels means that lower proficiencies are able to begin to ascertain language skills from the higher proficiencies, and the higher proficiencies can master theirs based on the teaching of the lower proficiencies. So as far as the Strickland perspective goes, there was two main ones that I think I really highlighted as being my own perspective that I really identified with. Giving the Krashen model a lot of weight seems to be very controversial nowadays, but I really identified specifically with his tools to succeed idea, giving students the resources they need to ascertain the knowledge they want rather than having them memorize it. So, for example, if I were teaching a chemistry class where there's a lot of chemistry naming that is very difficult to ascertain, having a booklet available that provides the rules constantly, and so students can look at that anytime they need refreshers or practice on how to name things is very critical. Also, having a chemical dictionary so that if students come across a chemical they're not aware of, rather than having to ask me or Google it or just not know what it is, they can actually go to the dictionary and find out what it is themselves and identify it themselves. The other perspective that I really identified it with was the idea of scaffolding and mnemonics. Really setting students up to succeed seems to be a very critical idea. And so I think that the scaffolding and mnemonics structure from the sociocultural approaches really gives an idea of context beyond the classroom. So I have an example here of oil rig. This is a mnemonic that we use in the chemistry classroom that stands for oxidation is loss of electrons and reduction is gain of electrons. So oxidation is loss, reduction is gain. It's a mnemonic. It's a very short, small one, but it allows students to internalize what oxidation and reduction is without losing the context of it, as well as chemical naming, giving students an opportunity to name things, but again, going back to that sociocultural approach, naming things that they see every day, naming chemical compounds that they're exposed to every day rather than things that are isolated. So, honestly, when it comes down to it, I think that all of these perspectives are very important and critical to the classroom, but they can't all be incorporated because some of them, especially like the systematic and explicit ELD, flies in the face of a lot of what the other three perspectives hold, and Krashen in particular tends to fight a lot of the current models that the other perspectives show. So I think that these two are very good for me personally because they focus more on students being their own agents and incorporating their own identities into the classroom. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that the other two don't have as much validity as these two.